By 1949, World War II was truly over. Japan was occupied and Germany was split in two. From the ashes of this conflict, the Soviet Union had emerged as a global superpower and began to spread its far left-wing ideals of communism across Europe and Asia, in what would eventually evolve into a political conflict known as the Cold War. This war would lay the backdrop for the election of 1949, in which Labour, under Ben Chifley, would push their luck for a historic third straight election win against the still-infant Liberal Party under former Prime Minister Robert Menzies. After seeing Australia through the end of World War II, and with the confidence of a solid victory in the election of 1946, Australian Prime Minister Ben Chifley would attempt to push ahead with his post-war policies of reconstructing and building the future Australia. Building the future Australia would involve, well, building stuff. Chifley's government would begin to use federal money to fund state-based public housing construction projects, which would result in massive suburban growth in the major cities. Along with this, Chifley would also begin work on the Snowy Mountain scheme, an ambitious plan to build a series of dams and hydroelectric power stations to both control the flow of water in the region and reduce Australia's dependence on coal-fired power generation. Weird how that's still a problem today. Along with the massive infrastructure projects, other legislation achievements would be made, including the introduction of a separate Australian citizenship, as well as the nationalisation of Qantas, today Australia's biggest airline company. Despite resistance from Chifley himself, the government would also establish the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, or ASIO, to combat covert foreign operations, particularly from the Soviets. One of the biggest legacies of the Chifley's government was changes made to social services. While social services had existed since Federation, the changes made by Labor in this period would drastically improve these services by expanding them to cover more of the Australian population, as well as remove several racial discriminations that prevented non-Anglo-Australians getting benefits, although Indigenous Australians would be left out of this policy. On the international scene, the Pacific War had given way to a series of Asian independence movements seeking to end European rule in the region. Chifley would be somewhat supportive of these movements and would hamper Dutch efforts to hold on to neighbouring Indonesia, as well as refuse to assist the British military efforts in suppressing uprisings in Malaysia. However, this non-interventionist policy would cause anxiety in the Australian populace when communists in China took control of the country, leading to fears that Australia too would soon be taken over by communists. Back at home, Labour's reconstruction was running into problems. Despite being an experienced treasurer, Chifley was finding his government short of money due to the extreme cost of reconstruction. To account for this, Chifley would attempt to force all government entities to bank with the state-owned Commonwealth Bank, thus bolstering the government's money pool. When this was deemed unconstitutional by the High Court, Chifley would make the extreme move of proposing the nationalisation of all banks in Australia. Nationalisation of the banks had always been a desire of the left faction of the Labor Party. However, it had been opposed by all Labor Prime Ministers up until this point. The proposal to go forward with this motion caused a massive backlash, not just from Conservatives, but also from several members of the Labor Party. This move was seen as the first step towards a communist future, since all of Australia's finances would now be under de facto government control, leaving them in a position to take absolute control of the entire free market and implement a planned economy. This move by Labor would be the driving force for the Liberal Country Coalition's election campaign. Robert Menzies had successfully avoided being replaced as leader and would successfully lead the campaign against bank nationalisation. Menzies would make use of his experience in radio broadcasts to campaign directly to voters across the airways, warning them about the dangers of Labor and their policies. If the election was not going to be ideologically filled already, in June 1949, the Miners' Federation of Australia would instigate a massive strike over working conditions in coal mines. This move was seen as an attempt by the Australian Communist Party, who had strong influences over the Miners' Federation, to attack Labor and promote communist leadership in the governing party. Not wanting to appear soft on communism, Chifley would refuse to concede to the demands of the strikers, and would eventually be forced to use the military to break up the strike. This would be the first time since Federation the military was used to break up a strike in peacetime. Despite actions made by the Communist Party against Labor, Chifley would not move to ban the Australian Communist Party. With the strike over, the election would be set for the 10th of December, and it was very clear that this election would determine the ideological future of Australia. Along with this, the 1949 election would also see the number of seats in Parliament increased for the first time in Australian history, with an additional 46 seats added to Parliament, bringing the total number up to 121. Seems like someone finally realised that 75 seats was not enough for a country whose population had almost doubled since Federation. And the winner was Well, Ben Chifley had successfully picked up 4 seats to hold a reasonable 47 seats, which would have meant victory back in 1946. But with the expansion of the number of seats in Parliament and Menzies picking up 45 of those new seats, he would win this election with a total of 74 seats, a number almost equivalent to the total number of seats in the previous election. This was the first election since Federation in which all the major parties gained seats. The reason for Labour's defeat at this election went far beyond just bank nationalisation. Labour's continued use of wartime rationing was also highly unpopular, and the continued insurgencies by communist sympathisers around and within the party had scared moderate voters away. At the end of the day, public perception had grown that Labour had become arrogant and was no longer fit to run a country, and thus, the longest-serving Labour government until this point in history came to an end. And with that, Menzies would again become Prime Minister. It had been over 8 years since he had last sat as Prime Minister, the longest hiatus for a multi-sitting Prime Minister in Australian history. However, things were not looking good for Menzies. Labour still had the Senate majority, and Chifley would remain leader of the Labour Party into the 50s to challenge the still infant Liberal Party's coalition. And as we know from history, governments without control of the Senate don't last for very long. Now let's just look ahead to the upcoming elections and... holy sh! Come back next time for the election of 1951.